Peter Parker finally got what he thought he wanted. Nobody knows who he is. Nobody remembers the boy behind the mask, nobody recognizes the name that once meant everything to him, and nobody can accidentally become a target simply because they care about Peter Parker. New York still knows Spider-Man, though. In fact, the city may know him better than ever. People see him swinging between buildings, stopping robberies, pulling strangers from wreckage, and appearing wherever danger breaks through the ordinary rhythm of the city. They cheer for him. They photograph him. They talk about him. To New York, Spider-Man is a symbol. But Peter Parker has become almost invisible. And that is the first contradiction at the heart of Spider-Man, Brand New Day. The world has not forgotten Spider-Man. It has forgotten Peter. For years have passed since Peter made the decision that saved everyone else by erasing himself from the lives of the people he loved. The choice worked. The danger was contained. The spell was completed. The world moved forward. MJ continued her life. Ned continued his. Everyone Peter sacrificed himself forgot the chance to live without the shadow of his identity hanging over them. And Peter got exactly what a self-sacrificing hero is supposedly meant to accept, a clean slate. Except a clean slate can also look like an empty page. Brand New Day understands something uncomfortable about the fantasy of anonymity. We usually imagine being unknown as freedom. No expectations. No judgment. No one watching. No one asking where you are or what you are supposed to become. But for Peter Parker, being unknown means something much more painful. It means the people he loves can look directly at him and see a stranger. It means he can stand close enough to hear MJ speak and still be farther away from her than he has ever been. It means he can watch Ned live a life that Peter helped make possible and know that stepping back into it could destroy the very sacrifice he made. So Peter does what Peter Parker has always been extraordinarily good at doing. He works. He patrols. He fights. He fixes. He saves. He keeps moving. Spider-Man has become a full-time occupation because Peter has turned heroism into a substitute for having a life. The city gives him something his personal world no longer can: purpose without intimacy. Every emergency gives him a reason to be somewhere. Every criminal gives him someone to fight. Every rooftop gives him a place where nobody expects Peter Parker to exist. And at first, that looks like maturity. It looks like responsibility. But slowly, the film asks us to notice something darker. Peter is not simply devoted to Spider-Man. He is hiding inside Spider-Man. That distinction changes everything. Because this is not the teenage Peter Parker who once wanted to prove that he belonged among the Avengers, impress Tony Stark, impress his classmates, impress MJ, and convince himself that being useful meant being worthy. This Peter already knows what responsibility costs. He has watched people die. He has watched relationships collapse. He has watched an entire universe of memory disappear from the people closest to him. He does not need anyone to tell him that being Spider-Man is serious. His problem is that he has begun to believe seriousness requires suffering. That is why the title Brand New Day becomes more complicated than a simple promise of renewal. A new day should mean possibility. It should mean beginning again. It should mean waking up after a difficult night and realizing that the future is still yours. But Peter's new day begins with an absence. The old Peter Parker is gone, at least in the eyes of everyone else, and the Spider-Man who remains has become stronger, more experienced, more relentless, and increasingly disconnected from the human being beneath the suit. The central question, then, is not whether Peter can defeat another villain. He can. It is not whether he can save New York. He probably will. The real question is much harder. What happens when Spider-Man gets everything he once thought a hero should want, but loses everything that made him human? That question follows him through every empty room, every late-night patrol, every glance at a phone screen, and eventually through the most frightening change of all, his body begins to change. At first, the transformation can almost feel like an upgrade. Peter notices abilities developing that he did not have before. His physical capabilities become stranger. His strength, reflexes, aggression, and relationship with his web-based abilities begin shifting in ways he cannot fully explain. For a character whose entire identity has always been built around the idea that his powers are something he learned to control, this is terrifying. Because Peter knows what it means to be dangerous. He has spent his entire adult life trying not to become dangerous to the people around him. And suddenly, his own body may be becoming the thing he cannot trust. That physical transformation gives the film a perfect external expression for Peter's internal problem. He has spent 4 years refusing to change emotionally, while his life has changed around him anyway. Now his body begins forcing the issue. He can either continue suppressing what frightens him, or he can finally confront the possibility that growing up does not mean remaining exactly who you were before the pain. Then there is the threat moving through New York. At first, it is difficult to understand. People behave strangely. Criminal patterns stop making sense. Damage control becomes increasingly important. Familiar street-level dangers begin pointing towards something much larger. The attacks do not feel like the straightforward work of a villain who wants money, territory, or revenge. There is something psychological about them. Something invasive. Something connected to identity itself. And that is where Brand New Day quietly begins revealing what it is really about. Everyone in this story has an unusual relationship with isolation. Bruce Banner knows what it means to carry a second self inside your body. Frank Castle knows what happens when grief becomes the only thing keeping you alive. MJ represents the life Peter lost but still refuses to possess. Ned represents a friendship that exists somewhere in Peter's memory even though the other person no longer remembers why it mattered. And the mysterious new threat represents someone whose own identity has become so unstable that even the boundaries between bodies and minds can no longer be trusted. None of these characters are accidental pieces of franchise machinery. At least, the most interesting version of the film does not treat them that way. They are reflections. They are warnings. They are possible futures. And Peter stands in the center of all of them. That is why Brand New Day works best when it stops trying to convince us that this is the next enormous MCU event and instead concentrates on one much smaller question. Can Peter Parker learn to live with Peter Parker? Because the film is not simply a Spider-Man story. It is a coming-of-age story arriving after the character has already technically grown up. It is a grief story disguised as a superhero adventure. It is a mutation story disguised as a body horror mystery. It is a story about responsibility that eventually has to distinguish responsibility from self-punishment. And it is a transition point for the MCU, where the arrival of Jean Grey and the growing presence of mutants suggest that Peter's personal crisis is happening at the same moment the larger universe is entering another transformation. That creates an unusual challenge. Brand New Day has to be intimate and enormous at the same time. It has to tell us something new about Peter Parker while introducing elements that could influence the entire MCU. It has to justify Bruce Banner and Frank Castle being here without allowing them to steal Peter's story. It has to introduce Jean Grey without reducing her to a teaser for the next franchise. And it has to make MJ matter without pretending Peter can simply return to the life he once had. That is an enormous balancing act. And the movie becomes most fascinating precisely where that balancing act begins to wobble. Because Spider-Man has always been a character about balance. Between Peter and Spider-Man. Between ordinary life and extraordinary. Responsibility. Between wanting to belong and accepting that he may always be different. Between saving people and saving himself. Brand New Day simply takes that familiar tension and asks what happens after the hero has spent years choosing one side of the equation. Peter has chosen Spider-Man. Again and again. Now the story has to ask whether he can choose Peter Parker too. To understand why that question carries so much weight, it helps to remember what audiences have already experienced with Tom Holland's version of the character. Homecoming introduced a Peter who desperately wanted to prove that he was ready for the larger world. Far From Home showed how badly he wanted ordinary teenage experiences even as responsibility kept pulling him away from them. No Way Home shattered the possibility of having both. By the end of that film, Peter understood that sometimes saving everyone means accepting that you may personally lose everything. Brand New Day begins after that lesson. But understanding sacrifice is not the same as understanding how to live with its consequences. That is where the 4-year gap becomes so important. The film does not need to show every painful day that came between those movies. The emptiness itself tells the story. Peter has had years to build routines. Years to become comfortable with being alone. Years to transform loneliness from an emergency into a lifestyle. And that may be the most dangerous transformation of all. Because loneliness can become addictive when it starts feeling safer than connection. If nobody remembers you, nobody can lose you. If nobody knows you, nobody can betray you. If nobody gets close, nobody can die because of you. That logic is emotionally understandable. It is also completely destructive. Peter has confused the absence of attachment with the absence of risk. But being alive is risk. Being loved is risk. Trusting someone is risk. Growing up is risk. And Spider-Man's greatest lesson has never been that suffering makes you worthy. It is that responsibility requires you to care. Brand New Day eventually discovers the difference. And once it does, every fight starts to mean something different. The web is not simply a weapon. The suit is not simply a costume. The mutation is not simply a plot device. And the people around Peter are not simply cameos. They become pieces of one argument. Peter Parker has spent years learning how to sacrifice himself for everyone else. Now he has to learn that responsibility also means allowing other people to care about him. That is the story hidden inside the title. And that is why the opening image of Peter surrounded by New York but completely alone is so important. The city is full of people. Lights fill the streets. Cars move below him. Screens glow in apartment windows. Thousands of lives continue without interruption. Spider-Man is everywhere. Peter Parker is nowhere. And for 4 years, he has convinced himself that this is exactly how it should be. The rest of the film exists to prove him wrong. The most obvious temptation would have been to follow No Way Home with something even larger. More universes. More variants. More returning characters. More portals. More references. More mythology. After a movie that brought together 3 generations of live-action Spider-Man, anything smaller could initially appear disappointing. But Brand New Day makes a different gamble. What if Spider-Man does not need to get bigger? What if he needs to get deeper? That decision places the film in a strange position within the modern superhero landscape. The MCU has spent years teaching audiences to think in terms of connections. Every character can lead somewhere. Every object can become a clue. Every cameo can signal another franchise. Every post-credits scene can become a promise. But audiences have also become tired of promises. After years of increasingly complicated shared universe storytelling, superhero fatigue is not necessarily fatigue with superheroes themselves. It is often fatigue with homework. Viewers can love a character while becoming exhausted by the feeling that enjoying one movie requires understanding 5 others. Spider-Man occupies an unusual position inside that fatigue because the character is bigger than the MCU. He existed before the modern shared universe. He survived different cinematic eras. He belongs to multiple generations. And audiences did not simply discover Tom Holland's Peter Parker, many grew up alongside him. That makes Brand New Day's central emotional premise especially powerful. The audience remembers Peter even when the characters do not. We remember his first awkward encounters with Tony Stark. We remember the homemade suit. We remember the ferry. We remember the Washington Monument. We remember the illusion sequence in Far From Home. We remember the 3 Spider-Men standing together. We remember MJ falling and Peter failing to save her. We remember the spell. The characters inside the story may have lost those memories. The audience has not. That creates an emotional distance that the film can use deliberately. We become witnesses to a life Peter cannot share with the people who once shared it with him. And in a culture where people are more connected digitally than ever before, that idea becomes strangely modern. You can see someone's life without being part of it. You can watch someone's photographs, follow their updates, see where they went, what they ate, who they met, what they achieved, and still be completely absent from their actual world. Peter's relationship with MJ becomes a superhero version of that experience. He can observe. He cannot participate. He can remember. She cannot. He knows what they were. She knows only what they are now. That difference is devastating because neither person is necessarily doing anything wrong. MJ is not cruel for moving forward. Peter is not weak for still caring. The tragedy is that love survived in one person as memory while surviving in the other only as an unexplained emotional absence. And Peter's response is telling. He does not try to force his way back into her life. He watches. He keeps his distance. He protects her. And he tells himself that this is responsibility. But eventually, the film has to ask whether restraint can become another form of avoidance. That question gives the story its emotional architecture long before the villain's identity becomes clear. Peter is avoiding MJ. He is avoiding Ned. He is avoiding ordinary life. He is avoiding vulnerability. And when his body begins changing, he tries to avoid that too. Everything he fears becomes something he believes he can solve through control. That is why Bruce Banner becomes such an important presence. Peter does not seek out Banner because he needs another superhero. He seeks him out because he needs someone who understands what it means to wake up one morning and realize that your body contains something you cannot simply command into silence. Banner's history makes him the perfect thematic mirror. His relationship with the Hulk was once defined by fear, repression, and attempts to eliminate the part of himself he considered dangerous. His eventual evolution came through integration. He did not simply destroy the Hulk. He had to understand him. Peter has reached a similar crossroads. He wants the mutation gone. Banner understands why. But Banner also understands that fear can make a transformation more dangerous than the transformation itself. And then Frank Castle arrives from an entirely different direction. If Banner represents integration, Frank represents isolation taken to its most brutal conclusion. The Punisher has turned grief into purpose so completely that the distinction between the two has almost disappeared. Where Peter saves people because he believes every life matters, Frank can justify killing because he believes some threats will never stop otherwise. Peter looks at Frank and sees a version of responsibility stripped of mercy. Frank looks at Peter and sees someone who still believes the world can be saved without becoming ugly in the process. Their relationship therefore has a strange humor to it, but underneath that humor is an ideological conflict. Peter believes that saving someone means refusing to give up on them. Frank believes that sometimes refusing to give up is exactly what gets people killed. Neither position is entirely simple. And that is why Frank matters. He is not merely the violent superhero inserted into a Spider-Man movie because audiences wanted to see him. He is a warning. Peter's greatest fear is becoming dangerous. Frank demonstrates what happens when danger becomes identity. Banner demonstrates what happens when danger becomes something you integrate. Jean demonstrates what happens when danger is imposed on you before you have the chance to understand yourself. Peter stands between all three. That is the real ensemble of Brand New Day. Not four heroes. For philosophies of power. And Peter has to decide which one he believes. The production of the film reflects that challenge. Following No Way Home was never going to be simple. That movie was both a massive commercial event and an emotional endpoint for a version of Peter Parker that audiences had followed since 2016. It brought together nostalgia, spectacle, fan expectations, and genuine character tragedy. The obvious sequel strategy would have been escalation. Brand New Day instead chooses reinvention. The 4-year time jump is crucial because it lets Tom Holland's Peter enter a different stage of life. He is no longer defined primarily by school, classmates, adolescence, or his desire to prove himself. He is an adult who has made a decision and lived with it for years. That creates a different kind of superhero drama. A teenage Peter can be impulsive because he is still learning who he is. An adult Peter can be impulsive because he is afraid to discover who he has become. Destin Daniel Cretton is an interesting director for that transition because his Marvel work has already demonstrated an ability to combine large-scale action with character-driven drama. His experience moving between intimate human stories and superhero spectacle gives Brand New Day a chance to remain emotionally grounded even as its mythology expands. The return of Chris McKenna and Eric Summers is equally important. Their familiarity with this version of Peter means the film does not have to rebuild the character from scratch. It can pick up the emotional consequences of No Way Home and ask what those consequences actually look like after the credits have stopped rolling. That is a harder writing challenge than simply giving Peter another villain. Because the audience already knows why Peter sacrificed himself. The interesting question is what that sacrifice did to him. The title suggests the answer should be optimism. The story begins with damage. That contradiction is the movie's creative engine. Production itself also demanded a physically intense performance from Holland. Spider-Man has always required an unusual combination of athleticism, choreography, stunt work, and digital effects, but an older Peter changes the physical language of the character. His movement can no longer feel purely youthful and improvisational. There should be experience in every swing, efficiency in every landing, and exhaustion in the moments between them. That physical exhaustion matters because Peter's body is becoming part of the story. He has spent years treating it as equipment. He wakes up, suits up, patrols, fights, heals, repeats. The suit becomes work clothes. The mask becomes a professional identity. And the body beneath it becomes something he rarely has time to think about. Then the body changes. Suddenly. The person who has been using Spider-Man to escape his humanity is forced to confront his humanity through his physicality. That is a powerful reversal. The practical filmmaking emphasis also matters because Spider-Man works best when the audience can feel the physical relationship between him and the environment. Buildings have weight. Streets have danger. Cars move with momentum. A punch should feel like two bodies colliding rather than pixels meeting pixels. That grounded physicality becomes even more valuable once Hulk, psychic powers, mutations, and larger MCU elements enter the picture. The more extraordinary the story becomes, the more important Peter's physical reality becomes. Because the audience needs something human to hold on to. That is also why the marketing has to protect the mystery. The more the film can initially present itself as a lonely Spider-Man story with a strange transformation and an unseen threat, the more powerful the later revelations become. If every trailer announced the mutant mythology, the Punisher connection, the Hulk involvement, and Jean Grey immediately, the emotional structure would become secondary to the checklist. Mystery gives Peter room to remain the center. And the central mystery is not merely who is attacking him. It is what is happening to him. That distinction becomes increasingly important as the first act unfolds. For years after the events of No Way Home, Peter has built a life that looks functional from the outside. He lives independently. He maintains his equipment. He moves through New York with the efficiency of someone who knows every shortcut. He responds to emergencies quickly. His reputation as Spider-Man has grown. But the more effective Spider-Man becomes, the less visible Peter Parker seems to be. His apartment does not feel like a home so much as a workshop with somewhere to sleep. Technology is maintained because it has to be. The suit is repaired because tomorrow there will be another patrol. Food is something that happens between emergencies. Rest becomes an inconvenience. The city never stops needing Spider-Man. And Peter never stops volunteering. That is the trap. If he were failing, someone might force him to slow down. But he is succeeding. People are safer because he keeps going. Crime is being interrupted. Lives are being saved. The city loves him. So how could anyone tell him that the way he is living is unhealthy? Peter cannot. Because even he does not want to admit it. His social media observation of MJ and Ned becomes one of the clearest windows into the life he refuses to acknowledge. He can see them existing without him. Their lives continue in ordinary ways. There are new experiences, new relationships, new routines. Peter has preserved the memory of what they were. They have preserved nothing consciously. That asymmetry is almost cruel. But the film wisely avoids making MJ a villain in Peter's tragedy. She is not responsible for the spell. She did not choose to forget. She is allowed to live. Peter's pain comes from knowing that her happiness is partly the result of his own sacrifice. He cannot resent her for benefiting from it. That is what makes his grief so difficult to resolve. He cannot simply get angry and move on. The person he misses is happy. And Peter loves her enough not to take that happiness away. So he puts the feeling somewhere else. He puts it into Spider-Man. That is why the first appearance of Detective Jean DeWolf and the growing street-level crime matters. Peter needs a world that gives him problems he can solve. Street crime is emotionally convenient. A robbery has an answer. A dangerous criminal can be stopped. A broken piece of equipment can be repaired. Grief cannot. Loneliness cannot. Memory cannot. So Peter keeps choosing the problems that have solutions. Scorpion and the criminal underworld give him exactly that. But then the patterns become stranger. The attacks do not behave like ordinary street crime. People begin acting as if something is moving through their minds rather than simply attacking their bodies. Damage control becomes involved. The boundaries between law enforcement, superhero intervention, and institutional control begin blurring. And somewhere in the middle of all this, Peter's own body begins behaving differently. The first signs are easy to dismiss. A new physical reaction. A sudden burst of strength. An unfamiliar sensation. An ability that should not be possible. But Peter notices. Of course he notices. He knows his body. He has spent years testing it. He knows what his powers feel like. And this feels different. The fear is not simply that he might become stronger. The fear is that he might become someone else. That is where the mystery becomes personal. Peter can fight a villain. He can investigate a conspiracy. He can stop a criminal. But how do you punch something that is happening inside you? His instinct is to solve the problem alone. Again. He investigates the attacks. He follows the evidence. He begins connecting damage control to the strange activity. He discovers that the threat may not be targeting random people. And the more he investigates, the more he is pushed toward people he would normally avoid. Frank Castle is the first. Their meeting is almost destined to be uncomfortable. Peter represents restraint. Frank represents consequence. Peter wants to understand why someone is doing something before deciding what should happen to them. Frank is much more interested in whether they are going to hurt someone again. Peter sees a dangerous man. Frank sees a young hero who has survived enough tragedy to know better than to pretend mercy always works. Their conversations are compelling precisely because Peter cannot dismiss Frank as simply evil. Frank's worldview was built through loss. Peter understands that. He just refuses to accept the conclusion Frank reached. That makes Frank less of an enemy and more of a possible future Peter wants to avoid. Then Peter seeks out Bruce Banner. The choice makes sense scientifically. But it also makes sense emotionally. Banner has spent years dealing with a transformation that once terrified him. He understands the humiliation of not knowing whether your own body can be trusted. He understands the fear of hurting people unintentionally. And he understands something Peter does not yet accept. You cannot always solve fear by removing the thing you fear. Sometimes you have to understand it. Peter wants an inhibitor. Banner wants understanding. Peter wants the mutation gone. Banner wants to know what the mutation is trying to tell him. That difference becomes increasingly important. Because Peter has spent 4 years treating his emotional life the same way. When he misses MJ, he suppresses it. When he misses Ned, he suppresses it. When he feels lonely, he patrols. When he is afraid, he works. When his body changes, he tries to suppress that too. The pattern is obvious once you see it. Peter does not process pain. He converts pain into productivity. That may be the most adult form of avoidance in the entire movie. He is not drinking himself into oblivion. He is not running away from responsibility. He is becoming extraordinarily responsible. And that is exactly why nobody notices that he is running away. Meanwhile, the mysterious attacker continues moving through the story. The body-hopping concept adds a disturbing new dimension because it attacks the very idea of identity that Peter has been struggling with. If a consciousness can move from one body to another, what makes a person themselves? For Peter, that question is already painfully relevant. He has one body. But he has 2 identities. Peter Parker. Spider-Man. For Jean, the separation becomes even more unstable. Her presence is initially hidden because the audience is meant to experience the same uncertainty Peter experiences. Who is attacking these people? Why do their behavior patterns change? Why does the threat seem to exist everywhere and nowhere? The answer eventually changes the genre of the film. Jean Grey is not simply a mysterious psychic villain. She is a person whose power has made her dangerous before she has had the opportunity to understand what that power means. Her search for her sister Sarah gives the mystery an emotional center. She is not moving through minds simply because she enjoys control. She is searching. She is desperate. She has been manipulated. Damage control's experimentation becomes crucial because it changes the moral equation. The institution that claims to manage extraordinary threats has itself become part of the reason the threat exists. That is a familiar superhero idea, but Brand New Day uses it in a particularly relevant way. Who gets to decide whether someone with powers is dangerous? Who gets to decide whether a mutation is a gift or a disease? Who gets to decide whether someone deserves freedom? And what happens when the institution making those decisions is more afraid of uncertainty than it is concerned with individual people? Jean's situation forces Peter to confront his own privilege as a superhero. Peter is powerful, but he has spent years being allowed to define himself. Jean has not had that luxury. She is categorized before she can explain herself, studied before she can trust anyone, feared before she can understand what she is. And Peter recognizes something uncomfortable in that. He has also been afraid of himself. The difference is that his powers came with a cultural identity he could control. Spider-Man is loved. Jean does not yet know whether Jean Grey will be. That makes her reveal the midpoint crisis not simply because the mystery is solved, but because the audience's understanding of the conflict changes. The villain is also a victim. The victim is also dangerous. The threat needs to be stopped. But stopping the threat cannot mean destroying the person. Peter knows what that means. He has spent his entire life believing that saving someone is worth the effort. And Jean becomes the ultimate test of that belief. Her psychic abilities allow the film to externalize another of Peter's fears, loss of control. She can manipulate minds. Peter's body is changing. Banner has the Hulk. Frank has his violence. All of them are dealing with some version of the same problem. What happens when the thing that makes you powerful is also the thing that can destroy you? The easy answer is control. The deeper answer is understanding. And that is where Peter's journey begins to turn. For the first time, he starts to understand that the mutation may not be an enemy. It may be a change. That does not mean he has to accept every consequence immediately. It means fear can no longer be the only response. This is also where Peter reaches his emotional lowest point. MJ is still distant. Ned is still living without the history Peter remembers. The people he has spent years protecting do not know that he is protecting them. His body is changing. His enemies are becoming more dangerous. And the one thing he has always trusted, his ability to solve problems by himself, is failing. He finally has to confront the possibility that Spider-Man cannot replace Peter Parker. The realization is painful because Spider-Man has been his entire life. If he stops running, what remains? That is the question Banner's presence quietly answers. Peter remains. The boy who loved MJ remains. The friend who misses Ned remains. The person who wants to laugh, eat, sleep, complain, and exist without saving anybody remains. The hero is not the only real part of him. That sounds obvious. For Peter, it is revolutionary. The final act therefore works best when it stops being about defeating Jean and becomes about deciding what kind of person Peter wants to be when the fight is over. Jean's powers reach dangerous levels. Banner becomes directly involved. Frank enters the conflict with his own brutally practical approach. Damage control's actions come under scrutiny. The threat expands. But Peter's role is different from everyone else's. Banner understands transformation. Frank understands violence. Damage control understands control. Jean understands fear. Peter understands responsibility. The challenge is making responsibility mean something better than self-destruction. Peter could choose the easiest solution. Destroy Jean. Suppress his mutation. Erase the problem. Walk away. He does none of those things. Instead, he chooses compassion without abandoning caution. That distinction is important. Compassion is not passivity. Peter still has to stop Jean. He still has to protect civilians. He still has to confront the danger. But he refuses to define Jean entirely by the worst thing her powers can do. That is the mature version of Spider-Man. The younger Peter wanted to save everyone because he believed that was what a hero did. The older Peter begins understanding that saving someone sometimes means seeing the person inside the threat. The DNA inhibitor becomes part of that resolution. But the emotional resolution is more important than the technology. Peter is no longer simply trying to erase what he has become. He is accepting that his identity has always been more complicated than a clean division between human and superhero. The mutation does not automatically make him less Peter. Power does not automatically make Jean less Jean. The question is what they choose to do with what they have been given. That is why the final confrontation can resolve Jean's immediate threat while leaving her larger significance open. She is not simply defeated. Her victimhood becomes clear. Damage control's responsibility becomes unavoidable. The larger mutant question has been introduced. And Peter walks away with a lesson that applies directly to his own life. Institutions can tell you what you are. Fear can tell you what you are. Trauma can tell you what you are. But none of them gets the final word. You do. The resolution with MJ carries the same idea in a much quieter way. When MJ discovers Peter's old letter, the emotional weight comes not from a magical restoration of everything that was lost, but from the recognition that Peter's love existed even when she could not remember it. That distinction matters. Peter does not force himself back into her life. He does not demand that she become the person she used to be. He does not treat the spell as an obstacle that must be defeated. He accepts that MJ has agency. And that is a major sign of Peter's growth. Love without possession. Connection without control. Care without demanding a reward. Peter finally understands that loving someone does not necessarily mean claiming a place in their life. Sometimes it means respecting the life they chose. But respect does not have to mean permanent isolation. That is where Ned's gradual recognition becomes emotionally important. A friendship that seemed completely erased begins to show signs of emotional residue. Memory may be gone. Connection is harder to erase. The film does not need to restore Peter's old life perfectly. In fact, doing so would weaken the entire point. A brand new day should not mean returning to yesterday. It should mean moving forward with what yesterday taught you. That is the difference between renewal and nostalgia. Peter cannot become the teenager he was. He should not want to. He has suffered too much, learned too much, and grown too much. But he can become an adult who finally understands that being Spider-Man does not require abandoning Peter Parker. That is the real resolution. And it also explains why the film's title feels less like a franchise slogan and more like a character statement. The new day is not the morning after the old life disappears. It is the morning Peter finally stops treating disappearance as heroism. That is the story's emotional center. And once that center is understood, the supporting characters begin to fall naturally into place. Bruce Banner is the mentor because Peter needs to learn integration. Frank Castle is the warning because Peter needs to understand what isolation can become. MJ is the emotional consequence because Peter needs to accept that love cannot be frozen in the past. Ned is the reminder that connection can survive even when memory does not. Jean Grey is the mirror because Peter needs to see what happens when a person is defined entirely by the power they fear. Scorpion represents the more traditional Spider-Man threat, the kind Peter knows how to fight. Damage control represents institutional control, the belief that dangerous things can be made safe simply by putting them behind walls. The hand expands the mythology, but the strongest use of that mythology is always the same. To make Peter's personal dilemma larger without replacing it. That is also why the film's character analysis is more interesting than simply asking who has the best powers. Tom Holland's Peter begins the story with an external goal that seems almost impossible to criticize. Protect New York. Keep people safe. Stop criminals. Prevent another disaster. But underneath that goal is a quieter internal motivation. Do not experience another devastating loss. If Peter keeps everyone at a distance, nobody can become another May. Nobody can become another MJ. Nobody can become another Ned. Nobody can become another person he fails to save. The problem is that this logic makes connection impossible. Peter has confused love with vulnerability and vulnerability with danger. So he builds a life where nobody can hurt him. The tragedy is that nobody can reach him either. His workaholism is therefore not simply admirable dedication. It is emotional avoidance with a superhero costume. Every patrol becomes another excuse not to think. Every fight becomes another opportunity to feel useful. Every crisis gives Peter a reason to believe that his suffering is productive. And because the city rewards him for it, the behavior becomes almost impossible to challenge. That is why the physical mutation works so well as a metaphor. Peter's internal life has been frozen. His external life has not. The body changes because change cannot be avoided forever. His powers become stranger because the person underneath them has become stuck. His fear of becoming less human is actually a fear that he has already sacrificed too much of his humanity. That is the psychological heart of the character. He is not afraid of becoming a monster only because monsters are dangerous. He is afraid that if he becomes too powerful, too isolated, and too focused on Spider-Man, there will eventually be nothing left of Peter Parker. The film's answer is not to make Spider-Man smaller. It is to make Peter larger. More emotionally complete. More willing to accept help. More willing to live with uncertainty. More willing to understand that responsibility is not the same as martyrdom. Jean Grey's psychology reinforces that idea from another angle. Her introduction is strongest because her identity is initially withheld. The mystery allows her to exist first as a disturbance before becoming a person. That mirrors how institutions often perceive people with extraordinary abilities, as problems before they are individuals. Her psychic abilities make the metaphor literal. She can move through other people's minds and bodies because her own sense of identity is unstable. The body-hopping concept turns identity into something physical. Whose body are you in? Whose memories are you carrying? What part of you remains when your surroundings change? For Peter, these questions are emotional. For Jean, they become literal. Her search for Sarah gives her something Peter has lost. A specific person she is trying to reach. That makes their journeys parallel but not identical. Peter is trying to accept a world without the people he remembers. Jean is trying to recover someone she refuses to lose. Both are driven by attachment. Both are terrified of separation. Both become dangerous when fear takes control. And both have to discover that love cannot justify destroying everyone around you. That is why Jean works best as a thematic antagonist. If the film reduces her to a powerful villain who needs to be stopped, the mutant introduction becomes another franchise event. If it treats her as a person whose power and trauma have collided, the story becomes much richer. Sadie Sink's performance is important precisely because the character has to communicate vulnerability without making the danger disappear. Jean should feel frightening because her pain is genuine, not because she is simply evil. That ambiguity also introduces mutant politics through a Spider-Man story. The MCU's mutant era does not arrive in isolation. It enters through Peter's perspective. That is smart because Spider-Man has always been one of Marvel's strongest characters for stories about outsiders. Peter is not a mutant in the traditional sense, but the emotional architecture overlaps. He is different. He is feared. He hides. He is judged by his abilities. He struggles to balance ordinary identity with extraordinary power. Jean represents what happens when society responds to difference with containment instead of understanding. Peter represents what can happen when difference is eventually allowed to become identity. That makes Peter a natural bridge into the mutant era. Bruce Banner's role becomes equally significant because he embodies a philosophy of integration. The Hulk was once treated as a problem to be eliminated. Banner eventually learns to live alongside him. Peter is being asked to learn a similar lesson. His Spider-Man identity cannot be surgically removed from Peter Parker. It is part of him. The healthier answer is not separation. It is integration. Frank Castle provides the opposite philosophy. Frank has integrated grief by making it his mission. He does not hide from his pain. He builds his entire identity around it. That can look stronger than Peter's avoidance because Frank at least acknowledges what happened to him. But he has also become trapped by it. His pain is no longer something he carries. It is something he serves. Peter sees the danger. If he spends the rest of his life treating sacrifice as his identity, he could end up in a similar place. Different methods. Same prison. MJ's role is perhaps the most delicate. She is not simply Peter's lost girlfriend. She represents a version of adulthood Peter voluntarily gave up. Her continued life reminds him that the world did not end when he disappeared. That hurts. But it is also hopeful. MJ's independence proves that Peter's sacrifice achieved something. She is safe. She is alive. She has a future. Peter's challenge is learning to care about that future without believing he has to own a place inside it. Ned serves a different purpose. He represents adolescence itself. The friendship Peter lost is not merely companionship. It is the memory of who Peter was before adulthood became defined by sacrifice. If MJ represents lost love, Ned represents lost innocence. Their gradual reconnection therefore carries a different emotional weight. Peter does not simply want his best friend back. He wants proof that the person he used to be is not completely gone. And the film's answer is reassuring. He is not gone. He has changed. That is not the same thing. The visual language reinforces all of this. Peter's apartment should feel empty because Peter's life is empty. New York should feel crowded because the contradiction matters. He is surrounded by millions of people and still experiences himself as alone. That contrast becomes especially powerful when Spider-Man is above the city. From a distance, the image is iconic. A superhero overlooking New York. But Brand New Day can make the same image sad. He is above everyone. And therefore separate from everyone. The higher Spider-Man climbs, the farther Peter becomes from ordinary human contact. Nighttime patrols reinforce that feeling. Daylight belongs to Peter's abandoned civilian life. Night belongs to Spider-Man. The city glows below him, but the suit becomes almost like a second skin he cannot remove. The red and blue of the costume carry the history of the character, but the body underneath begins changing. That creates a visual tension between recognizable identity and unfamiliar transformation. Web imagery becomes equally symbolic. Webs connect things. That is what makes Spider-Man's powers so appropriate for a character whose central crisis is disconnection. He can literally create connections with his hands while emotionally refusing to create them with other people. He can bridge buildings. He cannot bridge the distance between himself and MJ. He can catch falling strangers. He cannot catch the past. He can swing across a city. He cannot swing back into the life he lost. Glass and reflections deepen the symbolism. Peter can look at his own reflection and see a face nobody recognizes. Screens show him a life he cannot enter. Windows separate him from other people. Laboratories contain the scientific attempt to define and control what is happening to the body. Damage control's architecture can feel cold and institutional because its worldview is based on containment. Jean's cloaked or obscured visual identity reflects her status as someone whose true self is hidden beneath fear. Hulk's enormous physical scale makes Banner's transformation impossible to ignore. Punisher's grounded visual aesthetic brings the violence back to human scale. Each visual world becomes a different answer to the question of what power does to identity. And Peter moves between them. That movement is one reason the action can carry emotional meaning. Spider-Man's movement should never be random. A swing can express freedom. A fall can express vulnerability. A landing can express control. A fight can express panic. A pause can express exhaustion. The best action sequences therefore do more than demonstrate what Peter can do. They show us how he feels. When his mutation becomes more pronounced, the physical choreography should feel slightly less familiar. The audience recognizes Spider-Man's movement but senses something different underneath it. That is the point. The superhero is becoming unfamiliar to himself. The title's brand new day imagery can therefore be interpreted visually as transformation without erasure. Morning does not destroy the night. It follows it. Peter does not erase his grief. He learns to live after it. That is a much more mature definition of renewal. And the film's deeper subtext pushes this idea even further. Peter Parker is essentially the ultimate always available worker. He answers every call. He responds to every crisis. He never gets enough sleep. He rarely asks for help. He measures his worth by how useful he can be. That makes Spider-Man surprisingly relevant to modern life. A culture built around constant productivity can make exhaustion look virtuous. Being busy can feel safer than being vulnerable. Helping everyone can become an excuse not to examine yourself. Peter is the superhero version of that problem. He is never unavailable to the city because he has made himself unavailable to himself. The internet-era contradiction makes the story even sharper. Peter can be seen by millions while remaining personally unknown. People can recognize Spider-Man without recognizing Peter. MJ can appear on a screen while being emotionally unreachable. Social media creates the illusion of intimacy without guaranteeing actual connection. Peter has access to information. He does not have access to relationship. That difference matters. Memory itself becomes another form of identity. If everyone forgets Peter Parker, is Peter Parker still the same person? The film's answer is yes. But with a complication. Identity is not only what others remember about you. It is also what you remember about yourself. Peter carries the memories. Therefore the person still exists. But memory alone is not enough for a full life. A person needs relationships. Needs recognition. Needs someone who can say, I know you. Peter has spent 4 years without hearing that. Jean's story expands the question into mutant territory. If society decides that a mutation makes someone dangerous, what happens to the person underneath that label? Damage control becomes a symbol of the authority that claims to protect society but can become destructive when fear becomes policy. Peter's position between ordinary humanity and extraordinary ability makes him an ideal bridge. He understands both sides. He knows what it is like to be afraid of yourself. He knows what it is like to be feared by others. And he knows what it is like to be useful enough that people stop asking whether you are okay. That is why Bruce Banner's lesson matters so much. Integration. Peter does not need to choose between Peter Parker and Spider-Man. He needs to stop treating them as enemies. Frank Castle becomes the warning of what grief looks like when integration fails. His entire identity has become a monument to loss. Jean becomes the warning of what happens when society refuses to allow someone to define themselves. Peter's solution has to be different. He must accept change without surrendering himself. That is a difficult philosophical idea to dramatize. At times, Brand New Day may come close to overloading itself with symbolism, franchise mythology, and character parallels. That criticism is fair. The movie has a lot to carry. Spider-Man. Mutation. Jean Grey. Hulk. Punisher. Damage control. The Hand. Scorpion. MJ. Ned. The MCU. The future of mutants. The future of Spider-Man. The future of the larger universe. There are moments when the movie can feel like two different films competing for attention. One is an intimate story about an isolated adult Peter Parker. The other is a major franchise chapter preparing the MCU for its next phase. The first film is usually more interesting. The second is often more commercially useful. The tension between them becomes one of Brand New Day's central weaknesses. The same thing applies to the visual effects. The film has to move from grounded Spider-Man action into Hulk-scale physicality, psychic manipulation, mutations, and increasingly large set pieces. The danger is that spectacle can overwhelm emotion. Spider-Man's best action has always felt readable because the audience understands his body. When the frame becomes overloaded with digital effects, the emotional connection can weaken. The practical elements become especially important because they preserve weight. Tom Holland's physical performance remains the anchor. The swing has to feel like a person moving through space. The landing has to hurt. The punch has to have consequence. The body has to feel vulnerable even when the character is powerful. That is why practical stunt work and large-scale physical sequences matter beyond technical craftsmanship. They make Peter's danger believable. The same principle applies to Hulk. Hulk is visually enormous. But the audience needs Banner's emotional presence underneath the scale. Jean's powers present an even greater challenge because psychic abilities can easily become visually abstract. Body hopping needs to communicate possession, confusion, and identity instability rather than simply creating flashy transitions. The best visual effects therefore become storytelling. The worst would simply become decoration. The direction of Destin Daniel Cretton is most effective when he understands that difference. His background in character-driven drama gives the quieter moments weight. His Marvel experience allows him to stage action without losing sight of performance. That balance is difficult. Too much intimacy and the movie feels disconnected from the larger superhero world. Too much spectacle and Peter's emotional story disappears. Brand New Day constantly moves between those poles. The handling of Frank Castle is especially delicate because the Punisher carries his own tonal gravity. He can bring humor through deadpan reactions and brutal practicality, but the film cannot allow him to turn Peter's emotional journey into a joke. Bruce Banner has the opposite effect. His calmness can slow the movie down in a productive way. He allows Peter to talk about fear scientifically before the story forces him to confront it emotionally. Jean Grey introduces a different challenge. She has to feel important without making Peter feel secondary. That is why the film's best structure keeps returning to Peter. Even when Jean is more powerful. Even when Hulk is larger. Even when Frank is more violent. Peter remains the moral center. That is how the movie avoids becoming a crossover advertisement. At least, when it succeeds. Music plays a similar role. A superhero score is often treated as decoration, but in a story about identity, music becomes another way of separating Peter from Spider-Man. Heroic themes can announce the public image. Quieter strings or piano can reveal the private person. The Spider-Man motif should feel different when Peter is alone than when he is saving a crowd. The same melody can carry different emotional meanings depending on context. During MJ-related moments, The music should not simply tell the audience that Peter is sad. It should communicate the strange combination of love, memory, restraint, and distance. During mutation scenes, the sound should create uncertainty rather than immediately announcing transformation as evil. Jean needs a sonic identity that feels unstable, not simply sinister, unsettled. The audience should hear the difference between danger and fear. Hulk sequences can use heavier orchestral weight. Punisher's scenes can feel more grounded and percussive. And silence becomes just as important as music. A sudden absence of sound before an impact can make the action feel larger. A quiet room after a fight can remind us what the spectacle cost. Peter staring at MJ's image does not need a giant orchestral crescendo. Sometimes the absence of sound is the point. The city itself becomes another instrument. Traffic, sirens, crowds, footsteps, wind between buildings, the mechanical snap of web shooters, the movement of fabric, the impact of a punch, the weight of Hulk's movement, the unnatural sound of psychic manipulation, the weapons associated with Frank Castle. All of these sounds create different worlds, and Peter exists between them. The city hears Spider-Man as noise. Peter experiences the city as loneliness. That difference is subtle but powerful. When people cheer after Spider-Man saves them, the applause is a reminder that they love an idea of him. They do not know the person underneath. The audience does. That makes the sound of cheering almost bittersweet. It is validation without recognition. And that may be the perfect sound for Peter's life. The film's cultural impact becomes easier to understand through this emotional foundation. Spider-Man remains unusually resilient because he has never depended entirely on one cinematic era. The character has been reinvented repeatedly. Different actors, different tones, different universes, different generations. Yet the central emotional premise remains recognizable. Someone gets extraordinary power and has to figure out how to remain human. That is why superhero fatigue does not automatically become Spider-Man. Fatigue. Audiences can become tired of universes. They do not necessarily become tired of Peter Parker. The reported opening numbers reinforce that commercial reality. Sony's reported $360 million domestic opening and $932 million global opening position Brand New Day as a major theatrical event, suggesting that the audience's appetite for Spider-Man remained enormous even in a market where superhero franchises had faced growing skepticism. But the numbers tell only part of the story. The reaction around the film is also about recognition. People discussing Jean Grey. People reacting to Hulk. People debating Punisher. People analyzing Peter's mutation. People arguing about MJ. People trying to interpret the ending. People sharing scenes and memes. People revisiting No Way Home. People comparing the adult Peter to the teenager they first met years earlier. That is cultural continuity. Tom Holland's Peter has existed long enough for viewers to age alongside him. Someone who watched Homecoming as a teenager can watch Brand New Day as a young adult and recognize something different in Peter. The character has aged. The audience has aged. The problems have changed. That is why the more mature tone matters. A younger Peter might ask, how do I become a better hero? An older Peter asks, what kind of life can I have while being a hero? Those are different questions. The second one is harder. It is also more universal. Because eventually, most people discover that being useful is not the same thing as being fulfilled. You can work constantly and still feel lonely. You can be surrounded by people and still feel unseen. You can love someone and still have to let them go. You can become stronger and still feel afraid. You can change physically, emotionally, socially, and professionally while wondering whether the person you used to be is still somewhere inside you. Peter Parker simply experiences all of those things with a mask and a web line. That is why the movie's strongest moments are likely to outlive its franchise references. A future audience may not care about every piece of MCU connective tissue. They may not remember exactly which post-credits sequence was teasing which crossover. But they can understand Peter standing alone in a crowded city. They can understand watching someone you love move forward without you. They can understand being afraid that becoming stronger is making you less yourself. They can understand turning work into an excuse not to feel. They can understand wanting a new beginning without knowing what to do with the old pain. Those ideas are not tied to 2026. That is what gives the film its potential long-term influence. If Brand New Day becomes culturally significant, it may not be because it introduced another huge superhero spectacle. It may be because it marked the point where Tom Holland's Spider-Man became an adult character in his own right. His Spider-Man began as an integration story. He was introduced into the MCU. He looked up to older heroes. He wanted approval. He was part of a larger world.